Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm your host, Ramita Iyer, research analyst at the Institute. All through this month, we're running a special South Asia Outlook 2022 series that focuses on changes and challenges this year for each South Asian country. In this episode, I have with me Dr. Srinjoy Bose, Senior Lecturer in International Relations and Politics at the University of New South Wales. His research focuses on critical peace studies, including political order and violence, and state formation and democratization in fragile states and societies. In this episode, he will be discussing the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan, the crisis that unfolded, and regional implications. Welcome to South Asia Chat, Dr. Bose.
Thanks, Ramita. Thanks for having me.
So, the Taliban came to power in Afghanistan in August 2021, but no country so far has given it legal recognition. On the domestic front, too, there seems to have been some issues as there have been reports of divisions within the Taliban leadership. Can you give us a sense of what has happened since the takeover, how Taliban has dealt with this opposition, and where does the Taliban stand today?
Right. Okay. So that's a that's a fair few months worth of events that I'll try to summarize for your listeners. So, in the immediate aftermath of the Taliban takeover, obviously the dynamics on the ground were unclear. They were in flux, and really the Taliban were focused on consolidating their return to power. Yes, there were some divisions that appeared to be simmering. Much of it was pointed at or directed at the vision for Afghanistan going forward, right? So the messages that I was receiving from the ground was that there were certain figures within the Taliban who perhaps wanted to advance and promote a slightly more conciliatory approach in terms of the Taliban's engagement both with the international community and with her citizens at large. Those simmering divisions didn't come to much. The Taliban either denied the reports of those divisions, and those individuals whom they might have perceived as threatening or troublemaking, troublesome, they very quickly sidelined them, including a very high level delegate who had been leading the negotiations with the Americans in Doha and Qatar. So they quickly acted to either silence any reporting of divisions because it would undermine their position, understandably, and they sidelined these perceived troublemakers. Um, the other direction of opposition came from that small band of you know people who want to resist the Taliban takeover. Followers and acolytes of Ahmad Massoud, and so on and so forth. They hold up in the province of Panjshir, the heart of the former resistance from decades ago. They held out for about a month. They were completely surrounded. There was talk of them launching a resistance from Panjshir, but no one really took them seriously in the sense that they weren't in a position to do much. Certainly not without direct international military support. Them being surrounded by the Taliban, etc., and etc. The Taliban had completely cut them off. Um, Road access, goods provision access, internet access, they were completely cut off. So that resistance, they held out for about a month or so, and then they quickly crumbled. The leading figures left Panjshir and the country, indeed, and took refuge in countries overseas. So Masood and uh, Ismail Khan, for example, who had left earlier, fled to Iran, right? So that's as far as the opposition slash divisions issue is concerned. So what does that mean for now? The Taliban are firmly in control of the country. 5 months after the Taliban takeover in August. So that's where we stand as far as the Taliban is concerned.
So, one other thing that we've seen since the Taliban's takeover is that the economy has been doing very badly. President Joe Biden said in August that the US military withdrawal from Afghanistan would not mean the end of US support to Afghan people. But the policies of the US and other Western countries have largely been based on sanctions and isolation. What are your thoughts on the economic crisis that is unfolding in Afghanistan, and what has motivated this decision by Western countries, and how do you see Kabul coping with it?
Right. Okay. So I think the first thing to understand is that Afghanistan's economy has been in free fall for quite a long time. They've been in the midst of an economic crisis for the better part of a decade, decade and a half. So it's an ongoing situation, and obviously we might just speak about the humanitarian crisis as well, which dovetails with the economic crisis. But as far as eco- the economic sector is concerned, yes, they're not doing too well. In the lead up to the Taliban takeover, and in the months and year and a half spanning the American negotiations with the Taliban, obviously the system couldn't cope. There was a lot of uncertainty and precarity. There was capital flight. Obviously, investors were fleeing the country, knowing that the Americans were going to leave the country. There was apprehension that if the Americans leave, obviously, the country could topple to Taliban and so on and so forth. So we saw capital flight. Again, flight had been happening for a very long time in Afghanistan due to the deteriorating security situation. It just increased in the months lead up to the fall of Kabul. So investors were leaving, people were leaving. Afghanistan has been experiencing what we've come to call the brain drain, right, for a very long time. Refugee asylum seeking has obviously increased. People have been applying for visas in overseas countries for a very long time, and Afghanistan's been losing. It's peoples who they need to take the country forward, right, across sectors and industries. So it's been in free fall for a very long time. The economy exacerbated by the U.S. Taliban negotiations, culminating with the fall of Kabul. At the moment, yes, the central government's assets have been frozen by the West. There have been calls to release those funds. I'm not quite sure about the estimates, but it could be anywhere between 8 and 10 billion. There have been calls to release those funds so that Afghanistan can address the myriad economic problems and the humanitarian crisis. On a local level, everyday persons can't access their bank accounts. So they can't take out money for various everyday purposes, right? So they've been resorting to experiencing, well, you can't resort to experience it. So they've been experiencing poverty, hunger, and they have what we see is they've been resorting to selling property or assets to generate some income, money to pay for food or essential goods and items like fuel and so on and so forth. Uh, you asked about international motivations in terms of freezing these assets. Well, you had ostensibly a terrorist organization taking over the country. So it makes sense that their assets were frozen. It's not the Taliban's assets; it's the central government's assets. They have taken over the central government now, and the machinery of state. What you do with frozen assets is it's a separate question. Whether that's the international community, along with uh, Afghan stakeholders who might be in the country or overseas. They're dialoguing with them to try to figure out, and of course with the Taliban, to try to figure out, okay, under what conditions can we re-engage with the Taliban and release this money? So that has been, I presume, the focal point of many discussions between Taliban leadership and international actors over the past several weeks and months.
Delving deeper into one of the points that you mentioned, the humanitarian crisis. So, this has been an important area of concern globally. While the Taliban claims to have modernized, it has been widely noted that women are still largely excluded from public life. In an interesting development, though, earlier in January 2022, Taliban leaders met with representatives from the United States, France, Britain, Germany, Italy, the European Union, and Norway to discuss the question of human rights. Can you tell our listeners about this meeting? And are there any rivalries among major powers over how aid assistance has to be provided? And why are different countries at odds over this issue?
Sure, I think the issue about women's rights is a slightly different topic, although you can bring it under a broader humanitarian discourse. I think the immediate issue is that Afghanistan is on the brink of humanitarian catastrophe. Depending on whom you ask, they're already in the thick of it. They're already experiencing famine, but extreme acute poverty, food shortages, other essential goods shortages, and so on and so forth. And again, the humanitarian crisis, exacerbated by years of severe drought, um, the COVID pandemic starting in 2020, have worsened the situation. So peoples on the ground, individuals and communities are really suffering. So that's the humanitarian crisis that Afghans and the international community are dealing with and need to deal with going ahead. Um, but yes, I mean, if you think about it in terms of intersecting issues, then rights related issues are part and parcel of that broader rights related conversation, right? Yes, women continue to be denied access to schooling and educational institutions. They're not coming back in numbers. They're denied access to the workforce, right? So there are those issues, and that has a corollary impact on the economy, right? So if you're not going to have your schools and other institutions open, and if you're going to deny women access to the workforce, then that obviously has a negative effect on the economy. Coming back to the humanitarian issue, yes, the Norwegian government has held multi-party talks in Norway, in a town just outside of Oslo. Um, so I think that there have been representatives from the U.S., France, Germany, the U.K., Norway, and maybe one or two other countries, which I can't recall. Um, and I'm not privy to the agenda of the talks, and the talks have only just concluded. Like today is Wednesday, we're talking on a Wednesday, the 26th of January, so the talks concluded yesterday. So I'm not privy to the agenda, and we need to wait a while to see what was discussed, what were the roadblocks in negotiations, what were the successes and achievements, if any. But what one can make a reasonable an educated guess that one of the priority issues that were discussed was the humanitarian crisis, acute poverty, famine, and how to stave that off. And I imagine one topic at the center of discussions was the a topic of those assets that have been frozen. The Taliban obviously want those assets unfrozen. They want access to them. Recently, very recently actually, they made it very clear that they would like humanitarian assistance to be channeled via them. Now, this raises a lot of issues and concerns. The Taliban don't have a very good track record in terms of catering to their citizenry, right? We have decades worth of data that suggests they don't really care about their peoples. So, the threat of them siphoning off those monies, whether it's humanitarian assistance money that is brought in, or whether it's those state assets that are unfrozen, there is a legitimate fear that the money won't be going to individuals, communities, and peoples who need it most, and instead it will only benefit the Taliban military machinery, particularly groups like the Haqqani network. They will use the money to bolster and cement their power. And that even some of that money, aid money, assistance money / state money, could find its way into Al Qaeda hands. So we know that the Taliban have not severed ties with Al Qaeda. Those links, as I've mentioned on your podcast before, those are generational and deep. There is no evidence to suggest those ties have been broken. So money can be siphoned off to increase their power, to enrich their allies and partners whom they want to work with going forward, and so on and so forth. And the populace of Afghanistan is not going to benefit from the assistance or those unfrozen assets. So this fear, I presume, is on the mind of donor countries, international donor countries, right? So again, one could reasonably assume that several donor countries, if not all, want some kind of monitoring mechanism that tracks where the money is going, how it is being spent. They might even use monitoring efforts to perhaps articulate conditions. Now, both the policy and the academic debate on conditions-based assistance is hotly contested. There is truth to the argument that the moment you articulate conditions on humanitarian assistance, it doesn't work. It fails. It's actually more harmful. Conditions-based aid is actually an assistance does more harm than good. However, given the Taliban's track record of not really caring about their own peoples and their ties with unsavory characters, you probably do need some kind of mechanism that monitors where the money is going and how it is being spent. I suppose, again, one can make a reasonable guess over here that these issues were being discussed in Oslo. Yeah, what kind of should we implement monitoring mechanisms? Should we articulate and implement conditions-based mechanisms, or maybe even scaffolded and staggered conditions? Remember, I mean, I think people need to understand that even when you impose conditions-based criteria, changes don't happen overnight. It takes time to implement. So what does that mean? If it takes 6 months or more to implement changes to the satisfaction of those donor countries, does that mean the people of Afghanistan continue to suffer from the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding? So those kinds of questions need to be workshopped. As far as divisions are concerned, in addition to what I've already articulated, as far as the international community and the Taliban is concerned, is I think if you ask NGOs and civil society actors, they will probably say, no, don't impose conditions because it's going to be harmful. Um, but yet, it would be foolish not to consider the worst case scenario wherein the money gets siphoned off. So we do need some kind of middle ground between articulating and implementing monitoring mechanisms and extreme conditions based criteria, which aren't going to work. The UN, again, historically, the UN isn't very fond of a conditions based approach. Again, for similar reasons to NGOs and civil society organizations on the ground, because they see that it doesn't necessarily work. But again, the UN doesn't really have a very good track record when it comes to these kinds of activities. Whether it was in Iraq or Afghanistan, we know money gets siphoned off. So yeah, so you see that there are certain actors who uh, might not support a monitoring or conditions based approach. Other actors would want it, and it's finding the middle ground between the two. Um, from my observations and my own research, I think that approach where you acknowledge the limitations of a conditions based approach, and yet you uh, tell the Taliban and put them on notice that, look, we are going to implement some monitoring mechanisms, and future assistance might be conditioned on you complying with some forms of behavior, or standard of behavior. But what this does, I mean, at a broader level, though, what this shows is the leverage is all with the Taliban. If the Taliban get the money without any monitoring or um, um, conditions imposed on them, it's a win for them, right? They can do really whatever they want with that money and get away with it. And if they fail to secure those monies from international donors, after the international community cites that the Taliban didn't agree to these monitoring mechanisms, and so on and so forth. The Taliban can turn around and tell their population, "Look, we tried. We told them. Blame the international community for not wanting to help you." So it will only serve their propaganda machine. So in a way, the Taliban have all the leverage, and it's the Afghan people who are obviously going to be the losers in the end.
Finally, looking at regional implications, the takeover of the Taliban has provided opportunities for other countries like Pakistan, India, China, and Russia, among others, to play a more significant role in shaping regional dynamics. So, in this context, how does the Taliban government view the positions and interests of these countries? And going forward, what are your views on the role that Afghanistan can play in the subcontinent?
Well, look, I mean, let's start with the very last question. The role of Afghanistan in the subcontinent. I think they have an invaluable role, whether it's being part and parcel of, the economic landscape of Southwest Asia and, Central Asia, West Asia. I mean, Afghanistan is at the center of all these many countries, right? China recognizes that. China recognizes that, and that's why China, to a limited extent, want Afghanistan to be part of the One Belt, One Road initiative. I think Afghanistan's economic prosperity is contingent on how well they become integrated into the economic landscape of West Asia, Central Asia, and so on and so forth. Uh, However, it's difficult to see at the moment how the regional dynamics will play out. If you had asked me this question a few months ago, when there was a lot of conversation around India, Pakistan, China, and even the Central Asian countries' roles, it's died down a little bit. Uh, I think many countries are still playing the waiting game, right? Waiting to see what happens. Um, we know that the Central Asian countries, for the first time, are playing a more active role in engaging with Afghanistan, and that's a good thing for Afghanistan. So its neighboring, northern neighbors are playing a more active role. So that's a good thing. It remains to be seen how the Chinese deal with the Taliban. Um, I I suspect in the months to come, when recognition is awarded to the Taliban government, uh, if China gives recognition to the Taliban, I can imagine other countries following suit very quickly. Some other countries following suit very quickly. The same goes for Turkey. Turkey is also playing an increased role. If Turkey provides the Taliban with recognition first, I think the Chinese might be pressured to follow suit. And then what we'll see is a domino effect of countries giving the Taliban recognition. And likewise, if the Chinese go first, I think other countries will follow suit as well. Uh, I think the Taliban are aware of this. I think the Taliban recognize that their position is very strong. They have all the leverage, like I was saying. And by giving piecemeal concessions to donors and the international community of states, they recognize that in due course, they'll all come onto the same page as the Taliban. And that's exactly what we're seeing from this Norway exercise, right? The Taliban have said, their foreign minister has said, the acting foreign minister has said, this is our attempt to be seen on the world stage and to be recognized as the de facto ruling regime of this country. In other words, legitimacy, right? So that they see this exercise purely from that angle, so to speak. Now, the Norwegians have said, look, just because we've invited them for a workshop, a diplomatic workshop, it doesn't mean we are giving them any kind of recognition or legitimacy, which is not entirely accurate. I think by the very fact that you are bringing them on board, and you are having these incredibly important conversations about staving off an economic and humanitarian catastrophe, you are legitimizing the Taliban. Uh, so I think that we need. I think we need to be aware of these dynamics, right? Um, as far as Pakistan is concerned, again, we've heard various reports of the past several weeks and months that um, there have been some issues around Taliban Pakistan relations, in the sense that some within the Pakistani establishment might feel that they've lost some leverage with the Taliban. But look, I think those issues have always been present. The degree to which the Pakistanis, and particularly the ISI, control and have leverage over the Taliban has always been a hotly contested one, right? They've never completely and fully dominated them, right? There's always been issues. So I wouldn't read too much into any conversation that suggests, the Pakistanis and Taliban might be at loggerheads with each other, or that they're losing their grasp or grip over the Taliban. I think the facts speak a different truth, which is the relations are strong, as evidenced by the visit of the chief of the ISI when they visited, and the army general too, when they visited Kabul right after the fall of Kabul, right? So those relations and connections are strong. There will obviously be hiccups between those two entities and parties, uh, but I think it would be foolish to assume that that relationship is faltering. Yes, it is true that I think with the coming of the Taliban to power, the Taliban would want greater autonomy in how they run the country. But again, I see those issues being negotiated between the Pakistanis, ISI, and the Taliban in the future. Look, India has a big role to play, but India's been trying different things. Most recently, the Indians wanted to send 50,000 tons of wheat to Afghanistan as part and parcel of an effort to address the humanitarian catastrophe. And the Pakistanis blocked the transit of that wheat through to Afghanistan. So we can clearly conclude that they are holding um, hostages over here. The Pakistanis are, they're politicizing the catastrophe. And to be frank, I think the Taliban are doing the same. They're using the catastrophe as leverage to seek recognition for themselves. Like I said, China, I think, is playing a waiting game. I think they are more concerned about, ATIM and potential Uyghur militancy in their territory, emanating from individuals and groups or movements who might be seeking refuge and shelter within Afghan territory, right? So those sorts of issues would probably be on their mind. I think the Chinese are well aware of the limitations in their relationship with the Pakistanis. So, for example, we know that there have been incidents in the past where the Pakistanis have supported extremist elements who have gone on to conduct terror attacks within Chinese territory. So, um, those are issues to consider, but those are minor in the broader scheme of things in terms of eventually supporting the Taliban.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, Dr. Bose.
No, my pleasure. I mean, I'm happy to chat more if you like, or we can always reconvene for another chat on ongoing developments. I mean, the issue with Afghanistan is, as has always been the case, these events are fluid, dynamic. Things are changing. Will continue to change, not just over weeks but over days. So it's important to keep monitoring, but it's difficult also to glean any long-term trends and implications because of this, extreme flux that the country and its peoples are experiencing on the ground.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. Tune in every Tuesday and Friday for an analysis of latest developments in the subcontinent. To learn more about our work, you can visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter.